All right. Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving and welcome back to another episode of the No Jibber Jabber podcast. And I'm here with the illustrious Scott Austin. Scott, thanks for joining me.
That's a great adjective. Thank you. It's good to be here. You're in the media now with the podcast. It's awesome.
I'm in the media, so I just wanted to be able to relate to you, and I will have you give a little of your professional background because I mostly know you as the guy who takes my money on Saturday nights playing poker. But you're the SVP of strategic partnerships over at Dow Jones, which owns the Wall Street Journal. As you're repping there, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I work in the media industry for Dow Jones. We're best known as the publisher of the journal, but we also have other business and financial news brands like MarketWatch and Barron's and Dow Jones Newswires. We're geared more towards professionals. I've worked at the company for about 20 years as a journalist, bouncing around different divisions, and most recently as deputy bureau chief at the Wall Street Journal. But last year, I took the leap over the wall to the business side of the company and help with really our new strategy centered around partnerships with big tech platforms. So Facebook and Apple and Google and all of these companies where we can distribute our news to different places.
Yeah, and so my wife sometimes talks about she worked. When I met her, she worked for Forbes magazine selling. She was an account exec selling ad space, and so she reminds me when she says, if you want me to go back to work, just remember my industry no longer exists. And
Right.
so for you, it has changed a whole lot, and I think that's one of the really interesting things that I'm excited to talk to you about is just the death of newspapers in so many instances, especially the local newspapers, that the Wall Street Journal being one of the most trusted voices out there. But what has that meant like from a business standpoint, and what sort of changes have you seen?
Yeah, quite a bit. I think we've always prided ourselves as a company as putting truth to good use. That's always been our mission for more than a century, and we have to earn our readers' trust. We can lose it very quickly in this era where there's so much misinformation that's spread, where on social media people get their news in very different ways. It's kind of disaggregated. It's even probably more difficult, I think, to ensure that we can earn that trust from our readers. But because we have had that brand, that reputation precedes us, we've got the best journalism in the world. We are we actually have capitalized in a way, I guess, over the last several years, and that people are really also flocking to trusted news sources, and the Wall Street Journal is one of those, as are some of our major competitors like the New York Times. So in some ways, our subscribers are hitting record numbers during this whole run of the election. And during the pandemic, people are hungry to find facts and to find what's going on, and especially professionals who are trading stocks or figuring out what's going to happen to their small business. They are also coming to the Wall Street Journal for that information. But we can talk about this. Misinformation is also one of our biggest threats. The lack of trust in facts is a real potential problem for news organizations like ourselves.
Yeah, and I know you had a tweet that talked about the super spreaders of misinformation. And I think one of the challenges, I saw another study that showed the leading source of misinformation about the coronavirus was President Trump. And so, just in that, and when you talk about things like other sources of misinformation and what sort of impact that's had on this pandemic, that it continues. We're here in early November, and the numbers just over November. I saw you had another tweet where you talked about, we're now at a point where there's 51 deaths per hour. That was the rate in November, which is pretty staggering. And so how do you see that misinformation contributing to what's happening with the pandemic? How do those tie in together? And what are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, it's it's unsettling to me that I think for something like this, it's, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a societal issue. And even, we can't agree, a lot of people can't agree on the actual facts themselves. And it's a complex issue. So, we're often thinking about one side versus the other, and people who wear masks, who don't wear masks, while you're not concerned about small businesses and, suicide rates, and, while you're not concerned about people dying from COVID. It's a very complex issue. And I think what's different now than it was in the past, fake news has been around for as long as there's been a printing press, and centuries. There have been, propaganda, there's been opinion, there's been misinformation spread. But I think the scale and the velocity is what's different now. And, you might have had newspapers, people wake up to the morning, they read it, has a limited distribution. Then we had TV and then cable news. But because there's just so much information that's being spread on social media so quickly, it's hard to it's really hard to dissect what's real and what's not. I even have a trouble with that, right? Everyone does, because there's just so much information. It's huge volumes of information. Did the CDC really say that? Did they not say that? Yeah. And I think it becomes very troubling when it's not just the president. It's a lot of people who might say something, spread misinformation, and it spreads so quickly that even before it's by the time you fact check it, hours have gone by and kind of the damage has been done. So, there was a tweet yesterday that the president shared with tens of millions of followers from an anonymous account that wrongly said a hospital in Reno, Nevada. I think I tweeted about this earlier, that a Reno, Nevada hospital had set up a garage or set up a kind of a field hospital for COVID patients in its garage because it needed more beds and needed to kind of spread out the patients. And this is an unusual situation. This tweet called the garage hospital fake, and it had a photo from many weeks ago, as if it was right now, with a doctor in the garage, and in back of that it looked empty. There were no patients, and so it was in the context that it's all a hoax. Well, the president retweets this, and it's, I don't know if he knows this is real or not. It's not for me to say, but we've probably all done it. Everyone's done it, where you might have retweeted something before you actually understood the validity of it, or maybe you've even read the story. But when you're the president, or you're somebody with 88 million followers, it spreads so rapidly. So that by the time last night, I think it spread, it was 24,000 retweets, 80-something thousand likes. We're probably talking millions of impressions, which just basically means every time it shows up in the feed and you see it. Well, the AP, I saw the Associated Press did a fact check about 11 hours later, right, that night. So the President Trump retweets it at 5 in the morning. Almost 12 hours later, the AP comes out with a fact check. Well, look at what had happened in between that period of time. Yeah. And so there's a lot of research which we can get into about how fake news, falsehoods, replicate faster on social media than truth does.
Yeah. And how do you think, I mean, another example is when you think about the New York Post during the election, prior to the election, publishing the story regarding Hunter Biden and his laptop, which, the Trump campaign was very eager to have people pick up. And you really started to see Facebook and Twitter cast doubt on the veracity of these reports. And, so they started coming in, but how do they think about that? How can they keep up? Where's the line, and is it constantly evolving? And, how does that impact the Wall Street Journal?
And you're saying the social media companies, Twitter and Facebook, how are they reacting to it?
Yeah, how do they, I mean, the expectation is that they're stepping forward, and you see now on Donald Trump's tweets that they're the validity. This is in dispute with other facts around the election and things like
Yeah.
that. But then
Yeah.
you have things like the New York Post, which is not the Wall Street Journal, but is a newspaper that's publishing a story, and Facebook and Twitter are now in the place of saying, no, we're not going to allow
No.
people to share that.
Yeah.
That just seems like, and how do they make that decision, and how do they do it in real time? That's one example, but how does that scale, or how does that not scale?
It's a great question. It's so awkward. I mean, it's so awkward in that it's not consistent. And we knew when I used to cover, my reporters covered technology companies and Facebook and Twitter and others. And I remember us talking about this, I don't even know, 5-6 years ago. Facebook, I think at the time, maybe Twitter had said, we're not in the business of, we're not publishers, we're not in the business of editing anything. And so they stayed out of it. And we kept waiting because things were getting worse. And of course, the election happened in 2016, and then Facebook got a lot of grief. And you knew once they delve into it, just being in the news business and how difficult it is to fact check and to do that at scale, you knew it was going to be impossible. And it pretty much, I mean, unless they get to a point, I think they're sort of putting a Band-Aid on it until they get to a point where their robots can actually control this. And I don't know if that's ever going to happen. Zuckerberg has talked about that at Facebook, about that idea that their AI systems and machine learning, they're getting better, but it's going to take a lot of time for that to happen. In the meantime, we have to do it with a huge force of people, which just keeps growing into thousands, if not tens of thousands of people who are fact checking all the time. The reality is these networks are so large and there's so much information constantly being thrown on there, it's too big to manage. And so they have to focus on the so-called super spreaders, the people that have a lot of followers, that are the publishers that are putting information out there. But it's not perfect. I mean, blocking the New York Post, we all probably have opinions on it. I don't think it seems a little dangerous if a social media platform is blocking a news publisher, whether or not the story ends up being having problems or not. That's my personal opinion on that, no matter how much we believe the story. For the
it seems like a
journal,
really dangerous place. I mean, it just seems like for Twitter or Facebook to be censoring the New York Post, and who knows what was on Hunter Biden's laptop, or if that was even his laptop. But are we now looking at Twitter and Facebook to be the arbiters of that, or what's the editorial process at the New York Post? And that seemed a little suspect there. But how do you? That's one instance, but I wonder how that could possibly be built into robots, or.
Yeah, I think right now the U.S. government, the Senate committees, House committees, DOJ are all looking into regulatory issues with big tech. Are they too powerful? And some of it has kind of skewed into social media, and are they censoring? Are they doing too much? It's become almost bipartisan. Both sides are angry.
Right.
You can't really win, and it's not that. I think Mark Zuckerberg might say, well, that's a good thing, and that you kind of want both sides to be mad, which is the same way I think when we would write a story at the Journal, and you would have in the comments section people going after you from the right and people going after you from the left, and that ended up being a good thing, because that means you're kind of down the middle. Yeah. So Facebook's kind of, in this regard, I think they're not doing enough. I think they'll always kind of say, we need to do better, we need to do more. But it's extremely difficult place that they're in right now.
Yeah. And from the Wall Street Journal, I don't think many people associate the Wall Street Journal with Facebook. But when you think about Twitter, Google, Facebook, how important are those? I mean, they made you a VP just to, help deal with these things. But how important are those to the Wall Street Journal at this point in terms of distribution, and like what would it mean if you hear things about like when Facebook changes their news algorithm and the cascading impacts that has on media sites and newspapers. Like how important are, because I think most people still imagine the Wall Street Journal as the businessman's newspaper that you're physically reading versus even more. I get mine on the tablet these days, but what does that look like, and how do these social media sites play in from a business standpoint for the Wall Street Journal?
They're pretty critical. I cringe. I say it a lot. I say the word newspaper a lot, but I sometimes cringe because while newspapers are still very important to us and to a lot of our subscribers, we've spent years and millions of dollars in investment to become a digital company. You always hear about, I'm sure you hear about it in your industry, digital first and mobile first. So we still have a lot of work ourselves and to get to that point. I think we can't avoid where people are. They're not, we still get millions and millions of people coming to our site, but all of us by now probably spend time on one of these social networking platforms, or we're going to Google and we're doing searches, or we're looking in Google News. The reality is, while we might have had in the past people's attention at the breakfast table when they picked up to the newspaper, now we're fighting for attention everywhere. And we can just fight against everybody, or we can try to forge partnerships where our content, where our stories appear where people are. And that's what we've sought to do. It's certainly a puzzle, because ultimately you want people coming to your site, you want to be able to control the data. You don't have as much control when stories are on other platforms, but they're hugely important to us. They drive a lot of traffic and a good amount of revenue. They've been great partners overall. So yeah, I think they're really fundamental to our success.
And I think more and more people are getting their news from Facebook. That's their source of, instead of going to these sites, instead of going to wallstreetjournal.com, newyorktimes.com, they're just on Facebook and they're scrolling through, they're reading these stories. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was especially the coverage and what propagated in the Midwest and Middle America. And you tweeted out some of these headlines that I thought, when you were talking about the media coverage around the pandemic, which became highly political, highly politicized, and just some of the headlines that you had recently, like the Chicago Tribune saying it's a losing battle. The Minneapolis Star Tribune saying no beds available anywhere. Grand Rapids Press, we can't make more workers, in response to people saying, hey, you just need more beds because hospitals are filling up. What are you seeing out there in terms of the coverage and the information and the misinformation outside of the coast? What's happening in the middle part of the country, and how is that different here than here in California or in New York?
Yeah, there's certainly a realization. I think a lot of people are waking up to the problem, and I say that delicately. I don't mean to insult people that like they weren't paying attention, but as we know, much of this started on the east and west coast, or at least it spread through major cities in the coastal areas. It didn't affect the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and places in the middle. And now it is many months later, it's reaching this point, this very, very really tragic point where hospitals are filling up. And one of the biggest fundamental issues is there aren't potentially enough healthcare workers in some areas. And it's really hitting small towns, people in rural areas who were maybe reading about this in the news, maybe didn't believe it because they didn't see it. They may not have traveled, and now it's plaguing their small towns. I guess in regards to the tweets, what you're referring to is me basically saying, here's what's going on across the country and using local newspapers as examples.
Yeah.
And part of that is just because I'm a newspaper nerd. I love, I remember tearing out banner headlines from the Dallas Morning News when I was a kid and building scrapbooks and for big sports stories and things like that. So I've always loved newspapers. So I go to a website called the Museum, which is a museum that actually closed last year, unfortunately, but it was in DC and it educated people about the free and fair press. Probably tells you a lot that it actually closed, just like a lot of newspapers, sadly. They publish every day front pages of a couple hundred newspapers around the country. So I often go there just to get a taste of what actually is happening in small town America, in areas that I may not be familiar with. And you can get that from Wall Street Journal and New York Times in some doses of national coverage when we write a story. Maybe we write a story about the lack of healthcare workers, and we'll have anecdotes spread out. But the newspapers around the country will give you a good idea. And for I think looking at that, most people have, I should say most people, but many people have an impression of some of the major news outlets out there. Or if you say CNN reported, somebody might say, well, CNN's biased, or even the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times of left and right and this and that. But what I find with local newspapers, there aren't a lot of people that are really angry about the Kansas City Star or the Albuquerque Journal. And so I really wanted to find out, and I just noticed, this story after story in cities across the Midwest and the South, especially. They're saying kind of the same thing over and over about this hospital capacity problem. And if you're really following it, you might have heard about it, but it was stark to see these banner headlines in towns that probably weren't covering COVID as much. And now it had reached a level that was really troubling. And, I was just struck by the tone of the newspapers. There's no hysterics. There's no partisan punditry. They're just telling it like it is. And so that's what I was trying to do. And I think it resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it did. At this point, I get all my news just by following you on Twitter. So I appreciate it. But
Sure.
how I think if we lose the Grand Rapids press, like that just erodes these institutions even more. And so, with your perspective of the journalistic side, but now the business side, how does the Grand Rapids press, for example, survive? How are they around 5 years from now? What do they need to do? Because more and more of these papers, and especially when you think about, I would imagine local newspapers are still somewhat supported by advertising of things like restaurants and things like that, which now we're seeing more of those going out, and so there's just going to be, you would imagine, this domino effect. But how does the Grand Rapids press survive 5 years from now, 10 years from now? How do we have that so that our sole source of news is not what we see on Facebook, and how do they survive as independent entities? You'll certainly have your Wall Street journalists, your New York Times, your Washington Post, but how do these smaller ones continue to compete? I'm sure you've given that some thought.
Yeah, it's a great question, a very difficult one to answer. I have thought about it a lot. The journals, the New York Times of the world are doing really well right now. Most local newspapers aren't. In fact, I think the stat was something like more than a fifth, so more than 20% of all U.S. local newspapers have shut down in the last, I believe it was 15 years leading up to the pandemic. So a lot of small towns, a lot of counties have no newspapers. They're not getting any local news. And so a lot of people are reliant on social media. Hopefully they come to the Journal or another major reputable news organization. But a lot of people don't. They get their news from cable TV. So it's a huge problem, a huge conundrum. Some of this is a result of the media industry's own problems. A lot of newspapers, a lot of organizations didn't move quickly enough. They were reliant too much on advertising. And as you know, Brian, it's difficult when you're reliant so much on Google or on social media platforms because those algorithms can change. Certainly, the ad industry has changed. So these newspapers are already having problems. Then the pandemic hit, and the ad industry just started to kind of collapse into itself, and that's only caused more problems. So if you are not, if you do not have a subscription base, if you are strictly ad-based, you're probably suffering right now. It's just extremely difficult to be, 100% ad-based news companies. In fact, you go to some of these newspapers websites, and the newspapers are beautiful in print, and then you go to the website and it's just ad. You can't even get through it. It's just
click. Yeah.
nonstop pop-up ads. They're pretty desperate.
No, and I feel bad for them because I read one article and then I click on something else and it's like, would you like to sign up for a 6-month subscription? No, I was just hoping to read a second article, but they are so desperate.
That's hard too. And we all in the media industry and the news organizations all have some mechanism. You come to our site, hopefully we kind of lure you in, and then you try it out. I think what can be done. There's certainly subscription kind of paywall infrastructure that needs to be built in, and so there are some major organizations. I think probably all of us, kind of all the big national chains, are looking at ways that we can help smaller news publications with their infrastructure, building paywalls. It could be a metered paywall, so maybe you get 5 to 10 stories for free. But if you're really a dedicated subscriber and you want to get that print edition and every day read the headlines, then hopefully you pay up, and that'll help support it. There's no silver bullets. Google, for a variety of reasons, has spent a lot of money with the Google News Initiative to try to think of new and innovative ways for news organizations to build a more powerful business model. There's certainly been a lot in the kind of nonprofit area and foundations that have helped support a lot of local news, which I believe is my hope would be that would become a bigger piece of journalism. It really always has been about families, big families that kind of own giant news organizations. And someone like Jeff Bezos helps. But yeah, it's not easy when so many people are getting just their news in other places. So you really have to, I think you have to build a community. Easier said than done. It's almost like a membership within your city, that you're kind of part of this as a citizen of that city. You are part of that news organization in a way. We really listen to you. You can come to our forums. There's just some interesting things that various newspapers are doing, I think, across the country and around the world, to involve their readers in a bigger way, rather than just serving it to them.
Yeah, and I think instead of, if we lose the local newspapers, instead, they're local websites that some of them, like, you read through the comments and it's just it's discouraging for the future of humanity when you read what the comments versus actual journalism and those type of non-hysterical headlines that you mentioned. And it reminds me of like Jon Stewart, when he went on a few years ago, when he went on, I think it was Crossfire, and he was saying to Tucker Carlson, and I think you guys are hurting America because you have this platform, and people look to hear both sides of issues and to have these perspectives where people can then make informed decisions. And if things are slanted, and it just, to me, it seems as though we're moving more and more to this hyper partisan type of system where people, if you feel this way, you're going to go to OAN and Newsmax to get your information. And if you're on the other side, you're going to MSNBC and Huffington Post, and that we lose that ability to relate to each other. Is that something you're seeing? Is that something you're concerned about?
It's a great point. I'm old enough to remember Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw. on
Yeah.
TV as kind of the official news sources. Certainly Walter Cronkite before that, before my time. Um, yeah, there's no doubt that the kind of muddying of opinion and news has created issues. I think, in my opinion, that there's a lot more agenda-driven reporting. News and opinion are blended together. It's not always clear. You especially see that on TV, where everything the anchors feel need to inject their own opinion into the news. CNN a decade ago, was I felt like suitably boring in a great way. It was just
Yep.
straight laced people
Straight
just
down the
spoken.
middle. Yep.
Yeah, kind of what you see sometimes with overseas and some of the in Europe, very straight laced news, and now everything is almost like they're yelling at us.
Yep.
I can't listen to personally MSNBC for too long, or to Fox News for too long, or CNN. I like to kind of hear what's going on when there's a big news event. But yeah, I think it is a problem. I think it's an opportunity for the Journal. In some ways, it's voted across kind of party lines as being a trusted newspaper. People flock to us for that kind of factual analysis, and a lot of people read us for the opinion section as well. But there's definitely a conflation sometimes of people frustratingly on the news side thought we were writing an opinion piece, which can be a problem if they don't really know the difference, or they read an opinion piece and they say, great article, that's a great news article. And it's causing issues with media literacy, I would say.
Yeah. And so I mean it genuinely. You're one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter, Scott M. Austin.
Thank you. That's nice.
As a final question, who are kind of like 2 or 3 of your favorite people? Who should I be following? Who else do you think is maybe a bit off the beaten path? But who do you think are some of the really interesting people on Twitter? Because I know you're following. All right, brief technical difficulties, but we were wrapping up with, I was asking Scott who were some of his favorite people to follow on Twitter. So would you mind re-answering that one?
There's so many. Yeah, I was saying on kind of the topic of the pandemic and the hospital crisis, Ed Young at The Atlantic has been a great one to follow. I would plug some of my Wall Street Journal reporters. There's a lot of them, but for the economy, Greg Ip has always been an excellent source. You have Rebecca Bauhaus and Joe Palazzolo at the Journal who cover the White House. They've been exceptional. Rich Rubin, who covers taxes. He's actually my cousin at the Wall Street Journal. And we also have a bunch of tech reporters who are writing books right now. So Tim Higgins is writing about Tesla, and Elliot Brown's writing about WeWork, Trip Mickle about Apple. So there's a lot happening. So those are my plugs. I follow a lot of people in media. Someone like Josh Sternberg is interesting. He has his own newsletter and talks about the business of media. And a lot of venture capitalists, people like Josh Ullman, Josh Ullman is someone who has not only been a venture capitalist, but he's worked at Twitter and Facebook. He just went to Apple recently. So they're able to give a lot of perspectives on these platforms.
See, all someone needs to do, they just follow you and then check out who you're retweeting, and then
there you go. That's right.
Hey, man, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to the day where, 1, we get to play some poker in person, and 2, we can get a beer in person, and
there you go.
We can talk despairingly about our Dallas Cowboys. I didn't even bother. It's just been too depressing this year. So
yeah,
we'll save that for a whole nother podcast, and the questionable 4th down decisions by Mike McCarthy and the rest of the coaching staff.
Yeah, definitely another sports podcast. I'm happy to talk about that. So, but great to be here, and thanks. It was fun.
Thanks so much.